Hello. This little vodcast is going to look at the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, really looking at the key events around the second crisis you've been studying as part of your GCSE history on superpower relations, or Cold War to put it another way. So let's take it further forward, please. Bit of recap. Well, Cuba turned communist under Castro. Castro, to begin with, wasn't a communist, he was a nationalist. But because of Americans' response to the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the trade embargo and the break-off of diplomatic relations, Cuba gradually became more communist. And the Soviets supported Castro, first with economic aid, buying their sugar and offering them support. As we said, the United States enacted a trade embargo, and it also had a failed plot to get rid of Castro, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, with CIA-backed Cuban exiles trying to get rid of him. Because of this, Castro felt really scared. He felt America was out to get him. So he went to Khrushchev and asked for support. And Khrushchev not only gave him military weapons, but also placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. Kennedy found out about this on the 14th of October 1962, when a U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and photographed the missile sites. President Kennedy wasn't happy with some of the solutions that were immediately offered, which was really to kind of start blowing up large chunks of Cuba. So he created EXCOM, the Executive Committee, to come up with a solution, and their big idea was a blockade. So, what were the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, first off, we have the 22nd of October 1962, where President Kennedy announced to the American people in a televised address that a naval blockade was underway to stop Soviet ships getting to Cuba. This was the first real announcement that ordinary Americans had had about the crisis, even though it had been going on for a number of days. On the 24th of October 1962, the first Soviet ships encountered the United States Navy. An oil tanker was let through. It didn't have any weapons. But ships which were carrying missile parts, well, Khrushchev ordered them to turn back. Now, that isn't the end of the crisis. The next day, the United States began secret talks, and their idea was to remove missiles from Turkey in exchange for the missiles in Cuba being removed as well. Remember, one of the reasons why the Soviet Union put them there was because they were angry at nuclear missiles in Turkey being aimed at the Soviet Union. On the 26th of October, Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, he sends a telegram, how quaint, to Kennedy. He offers to remove the missiles in exchange for a guarantee not to invade Cuba. And for Kennedy, this is wonderful. He never wants to invade Cuba. He had egg over his face under the Bay of Pigs. He's never going to want to do that. So this is an absolute win for him. But the next day, a number of things happen that really make the crisis alter. Khrushchev then sent another telegram, and it's a new offer. It's like he's forgotten the first one. He says, in exchange for taking the missiles out of Cuba, he wants the missiles out of Turkey. So he's got two offers. On the same day, a U-2 spy plane shot down over Cuba, and the American military are saying they want blood. They want to bomb the site that shot that plane down. Kennedy ignores the shooting down of the plane. After all, it could just be a commander in the field who's not been told what to do, and just shot first and thought second. Then, publicly, Kennedy responds to the first telegram, ignoring the second telegram. But secretly, he's got his brother to meet with the Russian ambassador in Washington and agree they will move missiles from Turkey. They were going to do it anyway. So, on the 28th of October, Khrushchev agrees, and the crisis ends. So what are the consequences? Because one of your questions is definitely about consequences. Well, Cuba remains communist. It's not going to get invaded by the Americans. Kennedy promises not to intervene in Cuba. That's no biggie. He was never going to do it anyway. A bigger impact is that the Soviet leader Khrushchev looked weak. Remember, the missile deal to get rid of missiles in Turkey was secret, so he looked like he just backed down and got his missiles out of Cuba for no reason. And in fact, Khrushchev was replaced in 1964. Kennedy looked like a statesman and a world leader. One of his advisors has said Kennedy and Khrushchev have gone eyeball to eyeball, and Khrushchev blinked first. The long-term consequences were a lot more important. First off, telegrams? Not very modern, so a hotline was created between Washington and Moscow. In 1963, there was a limited test ban treaty. They said they would stop all nuclear weapon tests unless they were underground. The Soviets, though, built up their nuclear weapons and had a fairly decent number of nuclear weapons, roughly equal to the United States, by 1965. They also signed an outer space treaty, which aimed to avoid putting weapons in space. But perhaps one of the biggest ones was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it said that we would try to limit new nations that would have nuclear weapons. That's not gone that brilliantly. Well, this has been useful, but perhaps the important one was this. In 1963, shortly before his death, Kennedy made a speech which outlined how close the world had come to war, how much both sides had in common. And this, you could argue, shows perhaps the biggest consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the move towards détente, a warming of relationships between the Soviet Union and the United States. Looking at that quote shows how close we came. Thank you.